We're very excited to be here. Welcome everyone to Excelsior University's celebration of this year's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Excelsior Leadership, the Center for Social Justice, and the Race and Ethnicity Rope Team are thrilled to be hosting Reverend Darrell Goodwin with us as our MLK Day keynote speaker. We are honored by your visit, Darrell. It's so exciting to have you. But before I introduce you, I have the pleasure of sharing the stage with Dr. Pamela Jimenez, Program Director of the Center for Social Justice, who has kindly offered to get us started with a few words about Martin Luther King Jr. and about today's celebration. So thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Daniel. So Martin Luther King Jr. was a civil rights activist who advocated for nonviolent methods to achieve social change and civil rights in the U.S. for African Americans, famously using nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. MLK sought equality and justice, and his speeches and leaderships helped shape civil rights movement. As is renowned, I have a dream speech during the March on Washington in 1963. About 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to demand the end of segregation, as well as fair wages, economic justice, voting rights, education, and civil rights protection for all people. During his speech, MLK talked about his dream of a country without racism. MLK received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977 after his death. In the U.S., his birthday is now Martin Luther King Day, a federal holiday which celebrates MLK's life and legacy and is observed with rallies, marches, and speeches by civil rights leaders. As part of MLK Day, we are all encouraged to reflect on the principles of racial equality and nonviolent social change espoused by Dr. King. The 2024 theme for MLK Day is shifting the cultural climate through the study and the practice of Kingian nonviolence, a sustainable solution to injustice and violence in the world. According to the King Center, Kingian nonviolence is a practice derived from MLK's philosophy and methodology of individuals and communities learning to work on areas of conflict without resorting to violence. Welcome, Darrell. We are honored to have you. And back to you, Daniel. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. So thank you, Pam. I now have the privilege of introducing Reverend Darrell Goodwin, a wonderful colleague and friend, and a very exciting person to have with us today. Darrell is a Chicago native who brings vast experience in higher education, including several positions in Jesuit colleges and universities, such as Assistant Director of Student Life for Judicial Affairs, Associate Director of Multicultural Affairs, Acting Director of Multicultural Affairs, Assistant Dean of Students, Associate Dean of Students, and Dean of Students. Currently, Reverend Goodwin is the first Executive Conference Minister of the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. As a Chief Vision Keeper, he is responsible for guiding the conference and its affiliates to have a positive and lasting impact in our world. Reverend Goodwin holds a Bachelor of Arts in Human Development and Theology from Boston College, a Master of Education in Higher Education and Student Affairs Administration from the University of Vermont, a Master of Arts in Transforming Spirituality from Seattle University, where we work together, and is currently a doctoral candidate in the San Francisco Theological Seminary's Doctor of Ministry program. His dissertation topic is Praying Through, Using Group Spiritual Direction as a Strategy for the Retention of African American Men in Predominantly White Seminaries in the United Church of Christ. In his spare time, Darrell is an avid dinner party host, an amateur bartender, and is committed to bridge building. Thank you, Darrell, for your leadership and for your presence today. We're honored to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel and Pam, and just to the whole Excelsior community for this opportunity to be with you to honor the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also to give us some principles of how we can make his day not just another day off, but I might say a day on, a day to engage the principles and the truths of his life that continue to inspire us today. So I promise, though I'm going to be sharing some slides with you, friends, I'm going to try to make it as engaging as possible. So today we're going to be talking about visioning the beloved community. And I say visioning is because I believe that even when Dr. King was offering us this image of the moniker beloved community, we are still in 2023, we have not yet achieved it. So I want to say visioning it because it's something that we're co-building together, meaning that the paint isn't dry. So if you're still wondering when you can add your paint stroke to this tapestry that we're co-creating, please know there is still room for you. I want to give a little bit more context to what Daniel was sharing about me. I am a Chicago native, but I want to be very clear. I am from the South Side of Chicago, which has a very unique history. Really, the South Side of Chicago was a place that began to hold many of the people who were part of the Great Migration, which was African-American people moving from southern the United States to the middle of the country and to other places where they thought they might have a taste of freedom. They were people who had lived through a Jim Crow context in this country, and so wanted access to the same, quote, American dream that they felt had been afforded to other people. And I think that's important to name because that's going to probably color some of my beliefs and my thoughts on Dr. King's beloved community based on that context of growing up in Chicago. We also mentioned Boston College, University of Vermont, Seattle University. All of those places had their own engagement with how they were going to face diversity. For Boston College, it was Irish immigrants who were not allowed actually to have access to many of the other university contexts in New England at the time. And so Boston College wanted to be a place for migrants who were new to the country. University of Vermont continued to try to find its own way to bring diversity to a state that is still, in the context of 2023, 97% white. Seattle University was one of the first schools to say that they would allow women to also be educated alongside the men at the time, which was an all-male college. Then said, no, in order to make an equitable education, women should also be a part of it. The bottom, you'll see a picture of my grandmother, who's going to be 88 this year, who's a woman who lived through sharecropping in this country, who lived through a reality where she had to walk on one side of the street, a woman who had to sit at the back of a bus at some point in her history. She's holding this Black Lives Matter sign because even at 88, she's still trying to find ways to advocate for herself. You'll see a little symbol of diversity because I think that the world will only go round when we are all engaged. And then at the top is an obligatory picture of my husband because he always wants to know that I mention him in keynotes. So you have a little bit of a greater sense of me. So let's move into Dr. King. I want to give you a couple of quick facts, and Pam offered you some, and I just want to give some deeper context to some of these facts. So when we talk about that, Martin Luther King Jr. is the only American other than George Washington whose birthday is a national holiday. We celebrate Dr. King Day right now. We're even in this particular celebratory thing because it's what we say we agree with and it makes sense and it's an honoring of justice. But I think it's important to understand that the last state, which was South Carolina, didn't even agree to celebrate this as a national holiday until the year 2000. It's important to know that this had to be brought before Congress multiple times before there was an agreement that Dr. King should have even been honored. So as we celebrate this day, know that even be at a point of a celebration had to go through activism and pushing back against the status quo. On top of receiving multiple degrees, which you can see from Morehouse and Crozer Theological Seminary, Dr. King also earned his PhD from BU. I want to say specifically in 1955. So I want you to, again, put yourself back in the context of what it was like to be a person of color in 1955 and yet be seeking a PhD at Boston University. I say that because Dr. King's struggle didn't just show up at the bus boycotts. It showed up even in his desire to be educated in the context of this country. And it was through his own educational experience that he started to make some of the questions and challenge some of the things that we now know as hallmarks of who Dr. King was. I use it as an example because at every point of our educational journey, which we all are on right now, we can choose to engage in justice in a more deliberative and important way. And that's what Dr. King did during his own educational experiences. It's important to know that Dr. King was originally opposed to the bus boycott. It's one of the things that we celebrate the most. It's one of the ways in which often we're first educated about Dr. King and Rosa Parks. It was this bus boycott. But initially, he wasn't a fan of it, particularly because he thought it was unethical to put people's jobs at risk. I think that's also important for you to know. Everything that Dr. King did in the civil rights movement was methodical, it was planned, it had data behind it, and he was always considering the impact on other folks' lives. We can have an activism spirit. We can want to move towards justice, and we have to be conscious of how it might affect the lives of others. So before Dr. King was willing to fully support the bus boycott, he needed some data to suggest that people would be taken care of, that there would be a way to hold them. The oppression that he was seeing in Alabama at the time was great enough that he thought even if someone was going to be affected in terms of their job, the community would stand in and help them out. The other two quick things I'll mention is that we often talk about Dr. King's work in the context of race. And we think about racial justice and we think about Dr. King, but I also want to push for us just a little bit that Dr. King was thinking about civil rights in a more global sense. He was also thinking about economic justice. And when you think about the context in which we live right now, he was also standing against the Vietnam War. So this notion that we were going to go to a foreign country as the United States of America and say we are standing up for a particular community when he knew it was for our own self-interest, Dr. King adamantly stood against the war. Why is that particularly important? Because again, the narratives we currently have of Dr. King, he did not have that same welcome during his lifetime, particularly when he started to push against economic access, when he started to push against healthcare for all, when he started to say that we should be standing against unjust wars. Many of the people who would have supported Dr. King in his racial justice perspective didn't support him around economic justice, healthcare justice, or being anti-war. We can change a narrative, which is what we have all inherited. But I want you to know, as he was fighting for many of these things that we have not fully come into now, he was not celebrated as the figure we currently have. So quick recap, the holiday we now celebrate, fans know there was a lot of hard work to get there. Everything Dr. King did was thoughtful. And so we have the ability to think and then act. And it's important to know that healthcare, economic justice, and civil rights overall would have been a part of Dr. King's life, even if at the time they were not celebrated, they were not supported, and Dr. King was not seen as a positive, quote, American figure because he was willing to stand against the status quo. So this beloved community, when we talk about visioning this beloved community, and we have a little bit of the tapestry of who Dr. King was, the beloved community really came as from a philosopher theologian, Josiah Royce, who actually was someone that Dr. King really admired in terms of his writing and his philosophy. And he had this concept of beloved community that Dr. King expanded upon and popularized during the civil rights movement. Dr. King envisioned that the beloved community would be a couple of things that I want to highlight, and I've sort of highlighted them to pull out. The first was that it would be a global movement. To Dr. King, this wasn't something that was just going to happen in an American context, but it had to happen globally in order for it to be productive and inclusive and to, in his words, change the world. It had to be something that incorporated agape love, which I'll talk a little bit about later. That would be the driving force to these concepts of redemption and reconciliation. I want to say clearly, everything Dr. King was thinking about, he wanted it to be a place where all people, in his understanding of this justice matrix, there was no one left out. Everyone was going to be included in this, or else a beloved community couldn't actually be realized. And share in this abundance of wealth in the world. And we may hear wealth and think Bitcoin, stocks, financial wealth, but Dr. King was even talking about the resources that are just naturally a part of the land. I think he might have had a little chagrin at us paying for bottled water because in his mind, even natural resources like water should have been available to all people, gold and other, stones and different things like that, that we make valuable and very important. Dr. King thought people should all share in this because it is a part of the earth. In this beloved community, all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and dehumanization would be eradicated. Not on the shelf, not one comes out, the other one goes away, and then another one comes, but in his understanding, all of them needed to be eradicated. So there was no oppression Olympics here. Dr. King wasn't saying the racial struggle is more important than the economic justice struggle or the struggle for women's rights. Or if it was more in this context, if we were to even think about gender queer and gender nonconforming and LGBT folks, they would have been a part of this story that Dr. King was saying all rights should be paid attention to, and any form of dehumanization should be eradicated. What would you have if you let go of those things? He was inviting a more inclusive and interdependent existence of all people to live in this nonviolent harmony with each other. So we replace those things again with what I might describe as extravagant welcome and interdependence on one another. It means that I can't run ahead of you 5 paces knowing you're struggling behind me. Somehow, if I make it to the 3rd pace and I see that you're still at ground zero, I can reach back and help you along the way so that ultimately we get to the same place together. That we see the privileges and the strengths we may have as really a gift for us to share with those who may not have had access to those same resources that you have to help them also move along. And then the expectation would be, if I helped you and then you help the next person, collectively together, we are having an interdependent existence, which is going to result in nonviolent harmony. Dr. King says, our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require qualitative change in our souls, as well as quantitative change in our lives. He wanted you to understand, in order for a beloved community to come into existence, every one of us is going to have to sacrifice something. Every one of us is going to have to let go of the very things that we deem that make us comfortable, that make us feel settled, while we pay attention to maybe there is a sibling to the left, to the right, in front, or in the back of us who may, again, not have those same comforts. And so how do you have the consciousness that you can't be fully fed until your neighbor also has something to eat? You can't be fully clothed until your neighbor also has clothes. You can't be fully sheltered and have a roof over your head if your neighbor is somehow struggling in that. So he's saying, if we really want to do this thing, you're going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be some stretching, and you're not going to always be able to make it work the way you want to. I have a quick story of when my first international trip was to Nicaragua, and I went to this community. And the community had so many significant needs, particularly around educational access. And in my emboldened place during that time, I wanted to go, and I was going to go help build a school. And the community said, we don't want you to do anything for us in that regard. We will find the money to build our own school. And we've already started to build the infrastructure of our educational system. We want you to do something else. We want you to tell our story everywhere you go. Tell our story of struggle, tell our story of triumph, tell our story of love, tell our story of extravagant welcome. Friends, I was extremely uncomfortable with this request because I wanted to do something. And yet they were requiring me and asking me to do something. It was exercising a different part of my body and my mind than I was comfortable with at the time. You see, what I didn't know is that the school, once it was built and all of my friends, we gave the money, we may have felt like our work was done. But though that experience was over 20 plus years ago, I am still telling their story. You see, it captured a part of my heart and not just my mind. This is what Dr. King meant. If we want to build this beloved community that's inclusive of all people and gives everyone access to this universal wealth, it will require qualitative change and quantitative change. Something in me has to continually change every time I tell the story of my family in Nicaragua. What are the stories that you need to keep telling? Because just doing the thing, maybe passing the change to someone you see on the street, maybe doing one visit at a shelter where you're serving food, and you feel like, okay, maybe I've done enough. Dr. King was saying, no, I want that to continually be in your heart and your mind when you're sitting at the table with your family for Thanksgiving. I want you to be mindful that there's some other community members who may not have food to eat on the same day. And so then maybe you get to the point where you are not only sharing with your family, but if there is stuff left over, you are packing it together and then going out and offering it to our siblings so that they may have the same access to the meal that you had. These are the types of transformative changes Dr. King was inviting us to in beloved community. Another Dr. King quote, and I believe in using his own words as we also try to interpret them in real time. I want to read this to you. Love is creative and redemptive. Love builds up and unites. Hate tears down and destroys. The aftermath of the fight with fire method is bitterness and chaos. The aftermath of the love method is reconciliation and creation of the beloved community. Yes, love, which means understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill, even for one's enemy, is the solution. When Dr. King said, all people, my siblings, he meant all people, even the people we don't want to sit with, even the people we don't agree with, even with the people we have constructed are across the aisle because they believe that and they think this. For Dr. King, we were all part of the same human family. And we're trying to find that connection, even if it is reconciliation and redeeming of that person or that philosophical understanding through love. My next question to you, how deep is your love? How much are you willing to allow love to expand your own heart and your own mind, even when it's with people you do not want to agree with, you cannot imagine agreeing with, and you do not see the possibility of having a connection? Dr. King says, if we were to set that wall up, the beloved community will be absent of creativity, of redemption, and most importantly, love. So how might I summarize what Dr. King was saying? He's talking about agape love, redemption and reconciliation, and a concept of no insiders and no outsiders. This agape love is the sense of, am I willing to choose you, even if it may be of harm to myself? So in the civil rights context, it was white siblings who sat alongside African-American siblings and a lunch counter where Black folks weren't allowed to be there at that time. And white folks sat down alongside them and said, if you are going to put them out, you're going to put us out too. That's a form of that agape love. I'm willing to sacrifice my own privilege and sense of self so that you might have something as well. I often tell a story about being in Seattle and I was going to dinner and I had just shared in the context of my congregation that if you shouldn't just give someone food or money, you should introduce yourself. You should say who you are. And so here I was after I preached this amazing sermon about this, and I'm walking in Seattle, Washington, and a person comes up to me and says hello. I say hello to them. They say that they would like to have some food. I'm feeling good about my justice sermon. I say, yes, of course. And they said, oh, wonderful. And then they said, well, where are you headed? I said, oh, well, to get something to eat, but I can buy you something. That's no problem. And they said, oh, I was wondering if I could sit down and have dinner with you. That moment, everything I thought I stood for, everything I thought I meant, everything that was important to me was confronted in real time by another human being who was saying, I don't want you to just go buy me food. I'd like you to sit down and eat with me. So we went to the restaurant that I had made the reservation. The host wanted to ask me to the side, are you okay? Do you really want this person with you? I had to stand in the gap and say, yes, they are my guest. This stranger who I never met off of the street sat down with me and friends and had a meal with us. You see, I thought I was doing something for them by providing the meal, but they were doing so much more for me by reminding me of my humanity. That was the agape love. It went beyond just buying something to eat, but inviting the person to the table, sharing with one another, standing up to the restaurant who wanted to make sure that I was actually okay with this person who was another human being sitting at my same table. Another question, who are you willing to make room for at your table? That's how the agape love begins, by making space and room. Maybe it's a person of a different race. Maybe it's a person of a different sexual orientation. Maybe it's a person who has a totally different socioeconomic background than you. Maybe it's a person who desires a different political outcome than you. Are you willing to make room for them at your table? That begins with that agape love. Redemption and reconciliation. It gives us hope in the midst of the places where we do not see truth in one another, where we only hear things that make us want to run away, turn away, and not move forward. Are we willing to hear truth? I share with you, my grandmother's 88. She lives with me and my husband. At the beginning of my grandmother's journey around sexual orientation, she was not there. We were not on the same page. I tried articles, I tried books, I tried all kinds of things, and she was not able to wrap her mind around it based on her context and her generational understanding. But I had to stick alongside her, understand where she was coming from, while all at the same time maintaining who I was and the extravagant welcome that all people should be able to love whomever they choose. Somehow, through redemption and reconciliation, we found a way to honor each other's truth. That is what Dr. King was asking. How do we create the pathway to honor one another's truth? Not with intent to change the other person, but with intent to love the other person. I have the belief that through loving one another, we were both able to understand the fullness of who we were as human beings. Who do you need to expand your horizon just a little bit more so that you might receive the fullness of who they are as a human being? Then this last piece, no insiders and no outsiders. Dr. King was essentially speaking against the creation of a human social club. He was speaking against the haves and the have-nots. He was essentially encouraging us, do not create barriers that begin to make us forget about one another's humanity. When he says in the beloved community, there is no dehumanization, he's saying you cannot say you are more valuable than this person and this person is more valuable than one another because of maybe their financial access or because of where they went to school or because of maybe some of the material things that they have. No, he's saying we must find our common ground. We must find the way to walk alongside each other. And that's the only way we can move forward collectively. What blocks us? What blocks us from agape love? What blocks us from redemption and reconciliation? What makes us choose insiders and outsiders? I think one of the barriers is this reality that Dr. Naomi Remen suggests. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. My friends, we're wet. We're wet with racism. We're wet with sexism. We're wet with homophobia. We're wet with economic injustice. We're wet with a healthcare system that becomes inaccessible to most people. We're wet as we sit and try to live our lives in this context in the middle of a war, where people are being marginalized, minoritized, and harmed on a daily basis. We're wet when we wonder if we will have a democracy in this nation. We're wet when we wonder if whether or not in this season you might be able to go to the grocery store or someplace else without a mask because of another spike. And even with vaccines and other access to things, there are still people who are dying among us. When we are so wet, it causes things like compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue that literally means you begin to lose your sense of compassion. You get too tired to hear other folks' story of injustice, the intolerance that they've experienced, the being pushed to the side that they've experienced. Dr. King was saying we have to remedy even things like compassion fatigue so that we can see one another. If it's not compassion fatigue, and here's some more symptoms for it: compassion stress, experiencing illness, aches, and pains where we're routinely feeling bored and disgusted, losing compassion for people while becoming overly involved with other people, feeling as if we're working harder and accomplishing less. And yet, we want you on MLK Day to focus on justice, to focus on peace, to focus on nonviolence. Another way of looking at this is secondary traumatic stress. We, my siblings, have been living through a global health crisis, a global racial crisis, a global healthcare crisis, and depending on your context, we might be living in a political crisis, depending on the nation and the country that you're in at this moment in time. We wake up each day not knowing where another war will be started. We wake up not knowing if we'll be safe. These cause secondary traumatic stress. This is another barrier for us seeing that beloved community because we're so afraid of the preservation of our own selves. Another thing we battle in this work towards beloved community is loneliness. Look at these statistical understandings. 33% of people experience loneliness on a regular basis. 61% of younger people in the US say they are chronically lonely. 51% of mothers with young children, 42% of adults aged 18 to 34, always feeling left out. 57% of men and 59% of women reported being lonely. 60% of college students experience loneliness. Secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, loneliness. All of these things are just some of the contextual barriers that prevent us from achieving that sense of beloved community. So I want you to just think to yourself, where are you experiencing some of these things, even right now? Even though you said, okay, I'm going to be here, I'm going to come to this talk, I'm going to be ready to be embracing how do you create a beloved community, but these are the things that are in the back of your mind and your heart, and they may serve as those barriers. So I want you to hold that and be able to give naming to what you might be experiencing. So if you make it through and you start to confront that compassion fatigue, you're confronting the secondary traumatic stress, you're thinking more about how to take care of yourself so that you might come out of the bubble of fear and then choose to remedy the loneliness by trying to establish community, and I might suggest the beloved community. What are some grounding pieces to that? The first one is going to be Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence. So where are these going to show up? It's important to know, first of all, that nonviolence is not passive, but it will require courage. It will require courage for you to imagine that you won't be empty if some of your own privileges you afford to help someone else. Nonviolence seeks reconciliation and not defeat of an adversary. It means we have to change our language, and people who we may have seen as our, quote, enemies, we might understand that even in the midst of those beliefs, there might be a friend. Nonviolent action is directed at eliminating evil, not destroying an evildoer. This goes back to even when you are standing up for justice, inclusion, and welcome, it is not meant to demonize other people. It's not meant to actually harm people as much as it is to dismantle and eradicate ideas. A willingness to accept suffering for the cause, and if necessary, but never inflict it on others. This sense that if I truly want the world to change, I actually have to model the change I want to see. Now, most times we do not want to hear that. That seems too difficult. And yet it is one of the foundational ways. Rejection of hatred, and then a faith that justice will prevail. We have to believe this thing. We have to believe that even if the beloved community hasn't been achieved yet, it is possible. Some ways to do that in a very contextual way is get some information. If you're feeling like, okay, I want to know more about sexism and economic justice and anti-racism, and I want to eliminate homophobia and transphobia, I want to make sure that people have access to healthcare and that the economy actually benefits all people, educate yourself about it. That's the first step. Maybe you're not ready to go marching yet. Maybe you're not ready to write a letter to your congressperson, right? Maybe you are not ready to do your own deliberative action. So start with educating yourself by gathering the information. Knowledge is power in the truest sense. So this information gathering leads to your own education. Once you have that, make a personal commitment. Now, for some of you, you might have 10. Even in the midst of this talk, you've been like, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to do that. I was already prepared to do this. But I'm saying make one personal commitment. Maybe the personal commitment will be, I want to invest enough in helping myself with my own loneliness that I might engage in communities that are different than my own. Maybe your own personal commitment is to come to a lecture like this so that you can be more engaged in a context like, how do you build beloved community? Then do some negotiation. What are the things you've been raised with, the places you've been, the places you feel comfortable, and then where are the places you do not? And find some place to have an intersectional conversation between those things as opposed to only treating them as polar opposites. It may mean you need to talk to your aunt or your uncle. It may mean you need to go have coffee with grandma. It may mean you need to talk to a sibling or even your parents. But start the negotiation process, not to win over or to put your thoughts against someone else, but that you are talking to seek and understand so that you might negotiate what to do. And then act. Read the book, have the conversation, meet the new person, come out of your own box so that you might encounter someone else so that your horizon might be expanded. And reconcile. Not just with other people, but maybe some of the reconciliation is with your own self. Maybe you need to forgive yourself for the places you didn't get information, that you didn't educate yourself, the commitment you thought you were going to make last year, but didn't get a chance to, the negotiation you still haven't had, the action that you felt because you missed the opportunity, it's gone. I promise you, it's not. And the reconciliation. Every day we get up and take another breath, we have another option to reconcile to ourselves and to be in right relationship with others. So that was all easy, you know? Everybody's like, I can do that. I'm running out to do it right now. But maybe you have some questions about how to do that. So I want to be able to open up some space so that we can chat a little bit more.
Darrell, thank you. That was powerful and very provocative for us to think differently and hopefully act differently. Let me just say a few things that struck me that I thought were really meaningful as people think of questions. And please think of the question that you would like to ask Darrell and put it in the question and answer space in our Zoom platform so that then we can organize them as necessary rather than the chat. I was really moved by this concept of us pursuing our beloved community through qualitative and quantitative change. And particularly what you mentioned, Darrell, of our ability to change the narrative through our investment in change that requires our minds, bodies, and hearts. Not just thinking or not just doing or not just feeling. And the question of, are we willing to sacrifice our privilege so that we can share it with others? Who are we willing to make room for? Whose truth are we willing to honor? And I love the quote of, are we expecting to walk through water without getting wet? And all that that means. What is preventing our compassion? And particularly, I was appreciative of that was one question that I had, right? What small steps can we take to begin to engage? And your 6 steps of information gathering, education, personal commitment, negotiation, direct action, and reconciliation, I thought were really powerful. So thank you for sharing and for your energy and for your presence. Let's open it up for questions from the group. Anyone has a comment or a question? Pam and Linda, if you can.
Daniel, I want to just make a quick comment about what you were
Yeah.
just, and add one other layer to it. I think we also have to be willing to fail. And what I mean by willing to fail is to not get it right, to not say the right thing all the time, to not always have the right approach or the right answer, but to be willing to, quote, fail. And when I think of fail, I think of failing forward, because now you know, okay, that didn't work. Well, let me try something else. It allows you to be able to move forward and syncopation. I think we become blocked also in creating beloved community when we are so afraid that we're going to, quote, do the wrong thing. So maybe we've got information, we've educated ourselves, we've done some negotiation, and so we're ready to act. And so we go into the conversation and it doesn't go like we planned. And so then we shrink back and then we give up and say, that's not for me. I shouldn't do that. That's not where I'm supposed to be. And I think my encouragement is it's okay to fail. Part of the reconciliation with yourself might be to say, it didn't go as well. I wanted to build a beloved community, but didn't do it today. So how do I go back into it? And for those of us who have done those things and not done great, we need to tell the truth about it. Like, I tried this, it didn't work, but I'm trying again so that we can build that resilience. I think Frederico had a question. How do we address the obstacles present in the structures we are a part of? I think, it's interesting. Dr. King is often painted, particularly in his nonviolent work, like he just sort of was there sometimes and like, don't press against the fray too much. But I love the part of when you talk about the 6 principles of nonviolent strategy, for instance, courage is one of them. Action is another one. I think it's naming the thing that needs to be named. From a racial justice perspective, I call it the hello. Some of the reasons we haven't gotten to the deeper systemic change is because we don't even actually know how to say hello to each other. I think when we start saying hello to each other and we're in some form of dialogue with each other, we start to expose the gaps. But if we're quiet and we don't bring those things up, we don't name them, then we sort of let it happen. And I think about this sometimes in terms of our identities. If I find myself in a leadership reality and I'm with all men, all the time. Every leadership role I have, every board I serve on, most of the people in positional power or authority are men. The structure has discounted the voice of women. But since I'm now seated at that table, what do I want to do about it? And maybe it's simply naming, we have no female voices at this table. Oh, I'm noticing every time we get together, there's only men here. That's a way to start to, quote, interrupt. And I think from there, you bridge build on top. You follow the plan. We've gathered the information. We have the education necessary. We're negotiating how to move forward. And then we're ready to act and then reconcile, right? Because I'm not naming where are the female voices here because I'm trying to shame someone. I'm saying our experience is absent because it's not a part of the whole. Until we welcome everyone to the table, we're missing something here. And I think once we get comfortable saying that aloud, it becomes a part of the DNA of how we move, as opposed to this imposition that we have to do because someone's brought it up, made everybody feel uncomfortable. So now we have to act because of it or to it, as opposed to it just becomes how we move. So hopefully that answered you, Federico. I think it's about naming it, just saying it as the first catalyst to move forward.
Thank you,
Sure.
Darrell. I think we have some questions, Pam.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful speech, by the way. I thought the idea of Bridget asked, I thought the idea of no insiders or outsiders was very interesting. It seems we often think about making people who feel like outsiders feel like insiders. Can you expand on this idea or provide any additional insights on how we can make this mindset shift?
That's a great question, Bridget. And I think an analogy I often use is a table. Our first narrative of the table is, oh, if we want to be more like Dr. King, if we want to be socially just, we should just add more seats to the table. I think a way to do this is to ask the first question: why is there a table in the first place? And why is there a table with only a certain number of seats? I'm not sure that our goal here is to keep adding more seats to the table. And that's where, oh, you're an outsider, come and be an insider. I think if we really ask the question, we interrogate the table, maybe we start to dismantle it, and maybe ultimately we create a giant circle that every time we realize a voice is missing, somebody scoots back and we add another seat to the circle. So it's ever expanding. But there's no, quote, table. I think it's dismantling these things that we've deemed as just, right, and true, and asking ourselves, well, why do we think that? Why does it have to be this way? It's a very silly story that I like to tell, is about Thanksgiving dinner. And this great grandmother always cut a particular end off of her ham. And so then the next generation did it, and then the next generation did it. And then finally somebody said, wow, this has been a part of our tradition. We never eat that part of the ham. There's something wrong with that part of the ham. And the great grandmother was still alive. And she said, no, I just never had a pan big enough to fit the size of the ham that I bought. And so then the family was released to cook the whole ham and not cut that piece off. When someone asks the question, we get the information. When we don't ask the question, we're making the assumption. Generations have made an assumption that some part of ham is bad, because they didn't understand. Let's ask the questions. Why is this table here? Why is this boundary here? Why is this limit here? Why does somebody have to show an ID to get a food bag? We created that. Didn't say anywhere that you have to have an ID to do it. Why do you need an insurance card to get medical care? It's a system we've agreed upon, but why? I think pushing the why enough, I hope will help to dismantle some of that.
Thank you. The next question is, how do we engage with others who operate on extremes or fears promoted through mass and social media? Presently, we are seeing even blowback and mockery around MLK Day, reflecting on an overall trend of maintaining and upholding racism across a number of institutions. Jessica asked.
Oh, Jessica, just a very simple question. I think here's I think a very simple, though, invitation. Most of the time, people are reacting out of fear. Sometimes our fear shows up in teasing and mocking and mockery. Sometimes our fear shows up in discounting or saying something doesn't make sense or that we don't agree with it, when really we're just afraid. On a good day, because I'm not saying I can do this all the time, on a good day, what I try to do is create a space of listening so that the fear can be revealed. Sometimes when you ask that deeper question from listening, not with intent to discredit or discount, but just to have people articulate themselves to themselves aloud, they start to interrogate and question their own beliefs. So the extremism, once said aloud, once allowed to be spoken, not pushed back on instantly, explain to me where they came from, people tend to not be able, especially when it's a bigotry thing or a discriminatory thing or homophobic, or say they don't actually believe it, but they've either heard it, you said social media said it. So you just start asking the deeper question. Well, where do you think that came from? Why do you believe that? What does that mean to you? How do you benefit from that? Do you think that's harmful to other people? It's a simple set of questions that most people, in my experience, and when I said I can ask them on a good day, happen to just help them think through it. Most of the time, we're not helping each other think through anything. You say your point A, I'm going to say my point B. I'm probably going to come up with point A 1.5. You're going to do B 2.0, and we're going to keep going back and forth. But neither of us are listening to each other. There's a professor, Dr. Robert Nash, who suggests that a true moral conversation is that I might ask you what you feel and think and listen, and then articulate back to you what I think you're saying before I ever tell you my point or before I ever impose my belief. And then I might invite you to do the same. Can you hear me out? And then can you state back what you think you've heard me say? And then can we start the conversation from there? Then there is no A against B. It's I humanly listened to your A. You humanly listened to my B. Now let's negotiate about where we might walk together. That's my invitation for how we might do this Dr. King work, which is very complicated, especially to listen to someone who, as soon as they open their mouth, you were like, I agree, I disagree. It allows a little bit of space. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Darrell. We have time for another question. I have one, but I want to make sure that if someone has one, we let them go ahead and do that. I'll get started, and I'll still give you time to think of a question. But Darrell, I love the things that you're talking about and how you're pushing us to see the humanity in each other. We have brought a framework to Excelsior through which we are together working through this, through models and strategies to try to make space see the value of slowing down and to investing in learning from each other to do our best work, not just as a good thing to do, but as an opportunity to perform better, right? To let the collective intelligence around us flow, the voices, the stories, the experiences, the knowledge, the skills, the ideas. Could you talk a little bit about if we were to think more organizationally and the challenge that this pressure to produce and to find solutions and to respond to the needs, and this is happening in higher education and beyond, there's a lot of pressure for us to move fast, right? And to never stop. And there's always more to do. This concept of learning from each other, right, to do better. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts or even approaches on how to anchor ourselves on those, right, and benefit from them?
Daniel, as you were stating your question, the first thing that came to my mind was the embracing of the both and, not either or. I think the both and allows work to be moving forward while you're still, quote, perfecting the work. It's sort of when I started by saying that this work, the paint isn't dry. You still have an opportunity to pick up your brush and add a color to the palette. I think the both and allows us to not have to have it all figured out, which is what the race to success is sometimes about. I want to have this figured out. I want to have this all solidified so that we can say that we have done it. And I think a both and approach says, this is the best we can offer today. We're pretty clear that there's somebody missing. There's something absent here. We do not have all that needs to be there. So we'll revisit it. And maybe we'll revise this program. Maybe we will do it differently. Maybe there's a different program that we need to institute as a result. It allows both things to happen. For those of us who want the meal now, it's ready. For those of us who are waiting for the 32-hour dry-aged beef to be prepared, that's available too. I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying all things to all people, because I think that can sometimes feel like, well, what are you really standing for? But I think we're creating the holders for that which we may not even understand to come forward. Without the both and, no, we don't get it. It's just, we've ran ahead. There's a bunch of people who are left behind, and there's no syncopation between those two experiences, when there's still some things I need to hear and learn and see and understand, even when I think I have the perspective. Both can be true. And try to 2-minute story. I was doing a presentation with a trans man and a cisgendered woman, biologically born female woman. And they both were coming and I was leading. And I thought, oh my gosh, you know what? I want to do something socially just here. So I said, when we all walk in to the podium, you two walk in front of me. Like, you should be first, like, we want the transgender person to walk first. We want the woman to walk first, and then I'll come behind. Gesture 2, for me, it was righting a wrong. It was like, yes, the way the program was set up, I was supposed to walk in and they were going to come, but I'm like, no, we're going to change it all up. So I make this big announcement. I feel really proud. And the two people look at me slightly with a smile of endearment. And they say, oh, Darrell, you do know that you still have the privilege and the power that you were the one who told us we could walk in front of you. You do realize that even if you do this, this is for one event, because once we leave the next week, you still are the one who walks in. And it was one of those places where it was both and. I was both trying to honor them, and I kind of missed it. Like, it was like I did the thing, but I wasn't there. So we found a way. So they said, we have a different thought. Why don't all three of us walk in simultaneously together? There's room enough for all of us. No one has to be in front. No one has to be behind. We found both. I got to do something that I thought was like a small little dent in the injustices that they may feel every single day of their leadership journey. And they got to educate me. Like, you just doing this one day isn't going to solve it. I think that's our willing and working. How do we do both? And that was just an example of how we were able to find that synergy, but I had to be willing to go, oh, I didn't do that well. My heart was really good. I had the right thought, and I missed a little bit of their experience until they were able to bring it to me, and then we found a way.
Thank you, Darrell. So unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. This was amazing, and we're really honored by your leadership, Darrell, your willingness to share your knowledge and your wisdom with us. We've learned a lot today, so thank you. Before we close, any last comment you want to make, Darrell, before we close the keynote?
I do. It'll be really quick. It's
Yeah,
going to
please.
be a quote. If I just go to the end of my, it's not working with me. Just want to share this with you. It's from Neil Gaiman, and it just says, I hope that in this year to come, you make mistakes. Because if you're making mistakes, then you're making new things, trying new things, learning, living, pushing yourself, changing your world. You're doing things you've never done before. And more importantly, you're doing something.
Wow, that's powerful. Darrell, it's an honor to have you. Linda, thank you so much for your support. Everyone, thank you for joining today. We have recorded the session and we will post it in the Rope Teams platform, so you can have access to it. And if you want to share it, of course, you're welcome to do that. But thank you for this amazing gift, Darrell. It's so good to see you, and we're really, really happy we were able to spend this time together.
Thank you, Darrell. That was amazing.